So greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual component of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Our event tonight is called Globalize Liberation, Not Corporate Power, 25 years since the shutdown of the WTO. City Lights commemorates the 1999 WTO protests. Thousands of people from many walks of life came together to shut down the World Trade Organization's conference of that year. Over 50,000 people converged on Seattle to send a message that working class people would not quietly accept the runaway economic globalization that threatened their livelihoods. As a response to the events in Seattle, City Lights published the book Globalize Liberation, How to Uproot the System and Build a Better World, a global justice anthology that brought together many of the in the streets voices of the new radicalism from across North America and around the world. So joining us tonight will be some of the organizers and activists who participated in the WTO protests in an evening of recollecting the events and exploring the impact of the anti-globalization movement. We are delighted to have with us Stephanie Guilloud. She is the movement organizing senior strategist at Project South, Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide, based in Atlanta, Georgia. Stephanie co-created Organizers History Site related to her direct action organizing in 1999 to shut down the World Trade Organization. Also joining us will be Anuradha Mittal, founder and executive director of the Oakland Institute, and an internationally renowned expert on issues of human rights, agriculture, development, and conservation policies. Also with us will be Merle Payne. Merle Payne organized with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, contributor to Globalize Liberation as well, and co-founded Student Farmworker Alliance, and is currently co-director of Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en la Lucha, United Workers Center, a Twin Cities worker-led organization for racial, gender, and economic justice. Moderating the evening event will be David Solnit. David is no stranger to City Lights. He has been in and out of our orbit for many, many years. David is the co-editor of Globalize Liberation, published by City Lights. In 1999, he was an organizer with Direct Action Network and Art and Revolution Collective that organized the shutdown of WTO. He is currently an arts organizer, author, artist, and trainer in climate justice, anti-war, and workers' movements. Join us now in welcoming Stephanie Guilloud, Anuradha Mittal, and Merle Payne. I will turn the helm over to David Solnit to get the evening started. Welcome to you all.
Thanks so much, Peter and City Lights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on your Tuesday evening. And when I talked with City Lights about this event, I asked about doing an event with some of the organizers who most inspired me around the country. And I'm very honored that Steph, Anuradha, and Merle were able to join. And so we'll each share some reflections for 10 minutes each, have a brief conversation in response to each other, and then we'll take questions or comments that Peter will take from the chat. Also wanted to give a special shout out to book contributor Tom Wetzel, amazing San Francisco housing activist, Jason Justice, who did the amazing innovative design, and also Lupe from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who contributed a really brilliant essay on how they organize. So starting off with Steph, who I met as a brilliant student organizer at Evergreen College, working both with radical street theater activist groups and also the labor center there, helped found the Direct Action Network and helped shut down the WTO and has continued to do brilliant things. Welcome, Steph.
Thanks, David. And excited to be here with you all, and thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to be in such amazing company and excited to share tonight. And so I'll kick it off with just a few snapshots of what the experience was like that has absolutely shaped my organizing, a few lessons that we can draw from in today's movements, and then a challenge to all of us in this very dangerous moment which is going to require some bold moves beyond the shutdown, but towards building and practicing liberation. So grateful to be here. And it was a wild 5 days, and it was a lot of preparation to get there. But I'll share 3 snapshots. One, that first night when the police were tear gassing Capitol Hill, and we had shut the WTO meeting down. It was November 30th, and we were planning for the next day. Hundreds of people in the 420 space, an old nightclub that we had repurposed for all of the gatherings and spokes councils and work of that week. And we had won that day in a way that we didn't anticipate. We had taken them by surprise in terms of the cops and the meeting. We weren't arrested, and I was up in front with David facilitating this huge spokes council with all these other organizers. And people from the street kept screaming into the club about the tear gas outside the doors. So this was the setting of all this work that had culminated to this moment. And we knew that it was happening, and I think we could have rushed into that fray. But we'd made a decision to get organized for the next day instead of reacting to the chaos. And that was a hard decision, but it was the right one. And there are many, many stories, and probably many of you who are on this call were there, and you have your own stories. And one of the next few days, we locked down in front of the King County Jail. It was the 3rd day, and we thought we'd be arrested again. And we had trained up in jail solidarity, and many had been arrested, and brutally, and over the first couple, that second day. And so jail solidarity was a plan to not have IDs on us, to not give our names. And my crew had locked down on the doors, and we were demanding that our lawyers get inside and get folks released. And we thought they were going to do another round of arrests. And so we asked 2,000 folks, using all the mechanisms that we were using at that time, which was just call and response, basically, who would consent. And if they did, to pass up their IDs. And so this bucket of just hundreds of people's driver's license came forward. And for me, it was just a moment of an incredible show of trust and commitment to the organizing effort and what we were doing out there. So there were these moments like that happening throughout the days that were just quick thinking, long-term organizing, trust building across all of these different mechanisms. And then that last day, my friend Julia Allen said, everybody feels like they made this happen. Everyone feels like they did it. And that is a powerful collective feeling of winning. And that probably spoiled me for life, because I feel in my bones that we can win. And the experience of organizing in 1999 as a 22-year-old informs my organizing now. I've worked for the last 20 plus years at an organization called Project South. It's based here in Atlanta. I've played many roles, but right now I'm working as an organizer again. I'm a senior strategist. And I've shared with local organizers how the Direct Action Network shut down the city, the pie chart structure, the affinity groups, and we have a lot of that detail on the organizer's history site that David I and Nancy Hawk and Chris Dixon and Chris Bordy created as a love letter to the organizing work that it took to do this. So a lot of that detail is there, and I hope folks will take a look at it. But the Project South crew looked at that, they got inspired, they created a map of the 10 surrounding areas of our neighborhoods like a pie, and have consistently and steadily built inside, not to shut it down, but to build the power in each of those neighborhoods towards our own liberated zones. And we've also used the Spokes Council decision-making model at the Southern Movement Assembly, which is a convergence of organizations across multiple front lines in this massive region in the United States and we practice governance from the bottom up. And so people and organizers are practicing what it means to represent a group in real time with accountability to their home communities, not just elected officials, but as community leaders. And we need these tools like the Spokes Council, like affinity groups, especially those rooted in histories like the Spanish Civil War, anti-nuclear organizing, and other legacies of movement. And the other experience I draw from is to read the primary documents and understand the enemy. By studying the mechanics of the WTO and the ministerial meeting dynamics, as opaque as it was, we found weaknesses. The quote unquote developing nations were still needed and being courted, but to their detriment, and they were organized, and they told us later, emboldened by the demonstrations to fight from the inside, which was powerful. So we knew they didn't have a clear agenda. If we could disrupt in a significant way, it could have a real effect on what this international capitalist secret court would be capable of. And so I think today's movements, we have to understand those forces in motion at a little bit of a deeper level than we do now, to find the weaknesses, find the strike points, not just the political parties, but we need to research the tech industry forces, the finance capital in the 21st century, how it moves, how it acts, who it's responding to, how it uses propaganda, all of the different pieces. Exactly how the police state and prison industrial complex is expanding, tightening, and reconfiguring, as well as all the right-wing highbrow think tanks and the scrappy militias on the ground, everybody having their own historical legacies and are much more cohesive now than even just 4 or 5 years ago. So what I'm excited about with a talk like this and a conversation is because we're remembering a moment in social movement history, and a major way that opposition dismantles social movement is to erase our shared history of collective action. So I really appreciate remembering this moment and drawing the lessons. And so I just want to offer a few to think about as we're thinking about it and moving into this 25th anniversary. And one is that our organizing has to be global. We initiated and organized this shutdown in direct solidarity with global movements that had been challenging the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and structural adjustment policies crossing borders and crushing workers on all sides, and expanding the military empire to protect capital. And we organized in 1999 to challenge this institution that represented this particular economic model of global governance beyond the nation state. It did affect us locally as city councils were being bullied to accept the multilateral agreement on investment, ordinances privileging the Walmarts of the world. But I believe it really was a global solidarity and the understanding of international connections that drove the organizing, connected us to the indigenous forces, the international migrant and immigrant forces in Seattle, all of those folks who were in leadership. And just like the student encampments of spring in 2024, bravely demanding divestment from Israel in solidarity with the Palestinian movements for liberation, in 1999, we were organizing from our position as US-based young people and workers and activists. And we learned a lot. And the second lesson is that we learned about our own power, but we learned about the counter moves as well. We didn't think we could shut this thing down, but we were bold enough to make the call, and we didn't ever back down. And so we learned about the intensity of the counterattack. So direct and indirect. We watched how fast the state and corporate forces learned from their mistakes and reconfigured. So trade agreements shifted to bilateral agreements, anti-protest legislation spiked. The PIC and the police state learned super fast, used 9/11 to expand surveillance and every other tool that they have to contain and control. And today we're fighting those increased expansions of cop cities across the country, ICE prison expansions here in Georgia as a direct result of our successful campaign to shut down one of them in 2021. We're now looking at one of the largest in the country. We know that Miami police trained with Seattle police to prepare for a protest in a few years later. And of course, 9/11, the state built for the long game. So now the term protester and the practice of dissent has become synonymous with terrorists and terrorism in order for the full power of a loaded court system to attack and dismantle social movements. But we're still fighting and building. So we've learned from that move and counter move dynamic. And I'll close with one of the biggest lessons from Seattle that I think we need to consider in this political moment. We have to prepare to win, which I think means celebrating and recognizing collective action when it happens and the people that make it happen, holding the win. The WTO failed, and it did not fully recover after 1999. That's important to note, but we did not leverage that win enough. We have to prepare to prevent or protect against the counterattack, which is fierce, insidious, and constant, and we have to exercise power. And so that means we have to practice, we have to organize beyond the obvious win. We have to build a plan to govern in this moment and build the infrastructure to do that. So I think that so many of the pieces and lessons from the WTO shutdown organizing can prepare us now. It was training and preparation, it was researching the enemy, and it was knowing ourselves and that we're more capable of the possibilities that we dream of than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. So I'll close with that challenge and hope that we're going to organize to win.
Thank you so much, Steph, for that. A lot to chew on there. I'll invite folks to introduce yourselves in the chat where you're joining us from, and also what you were doing 25 years ago. We got Lupe, who was picking coffee in Guatemala, and Leo, I think it is, who is not yet born. So please join us in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, Anuradha, director of the Oakland Institute, of which I'm a proud fellow, and have great memories. Anuradha and the Oakland Institute invited myself and our beloved comrade Becky Tarbotten, who's passed, too young, to join us at the WTO in Hong Kong, and just have great memories of Anuradha was confronting the corporates and government officials on the inside and in the streets. And remember, as we were following the Asian social movements, particularly the Korean farmers and workers who were sort of toying with the Hong Kong police, who were very inexperienced at street demonstrations. And Anuradha joined together with the Korean farmers, workers, and all the movements from Asia in the front as we were getting pepper sprayed and tear gassed on the outside. You know, and then each night we would go home and write a short account for the Oakland Institute blog. But thank you so much for joining us, Anuradha.
Thank you, David. It's such a joy to be here, and just grateful for each one of you. And Stephanie, thank you for those very powerful words. As I was thinking about today, I was trying to recall what was I doing then. But I think it's more important, as you described, Stephanie, to talk about the marathon it was to prepare for those days. It took years to understand this new constitution that these corporations wanted to impose on humanity, new laws and regulations. So it took a long time to understand what this constitution of the World Trade Organization was. What does it mean in terms of agreement on agriculture? The euphemisms that were thrown at us and at humanity, liberalization, free trade, all of these sounded good because they were about freedom. They were about suddenly no need for borders, that there would be no need for countries to have their food reserves. The food would just flow. So there were a lot of euphemisms. There was a lot to understand. There was a lot of legal language, and that made it essential that we were ready for a marathon race. This work that was done from direct action to understanding started years in advance to understand what these corporations invested, through governments, were really seeking to do. The other thing that we were doing is to understand that the attacks that were going to happen on humanity, they were global, as Steffi just said. And that required cross-border alliances, because it was very easy to divide, as we saw the workers in the North lose their jobs, as the companies, corporations got footloose and they could just move across borders to countries where they wouldn't have to pay decent wages, where they wouldn't have to pay even the minimum wage, where they would violate environmental standards. We had to build those alliances between workers' councils, between unions, to understand that what was happening, for instance, to a worker who was formerly a unionized worker losing their job in the United States had a lot in common with, say, workers in China, in Mexico. So we could not be divided. So there were a lot of cross-border organizing to happen. Personally, I was very involved around agriculture issues. So making connections, whether it was the Korean farmers organizations or whether it was the Indian farmers movement, with the national farmers groups in the United States, to be able to see that this agreement on agriculture was a race to the bottom. It was not going to benefit family farmers anywhere, whether it was Europe, whether it was United States or India. To be able to come together as one force to basically take on the Cargills and the ADM. And at the same time, it required, along with investigation, finding who are the people behind these agreements and expose them. What we always call the Dracula impact, shine the light on them so they have no place to hide or no place to run. So for instance, the multilateral agreement on investment, who were the forces behind it? Who were the drivers behind it who would benefit while they put our planet and people under such jeopardy and devastated lives in the environment? So after a lot of investigation, after a lot of understanding, after a lot of those cross-border and cross-issue alliances, to be able to come together from workers' rights to environmental issues, to build those bridges so we could actually build a strong force that required a lot of, like Steph described, there were sessions, but there were also meetings. I remember before, the meeting started, the big teach-in that was organized by the International Forum on Globalization. As a young researcher then, researching these, speaking and spending time and breaking bread with the different farmer movements, but suddenly finding myself on a tractor through the streets of Seattle and recognizing that the time had come to finally, after learning, after organizing, it was time to mobilize. Steph touched upon a lot of the lessons. I think the biggest thing that I learned from that, and Steph, as you beautifully described, that we can win, that as we came together, it was really seeing that dedicated, that meticulous organizing, that research, those cross-border alliances yielded results, that we could win. Nobody would have imagined that the WTO would fail, not in Mexico, not in some other Latin American country or Asia. It collapsed. It shut down in the United States of America, the belly of the beast, the bastion of capitalism. That's where we shut it down. And even now, as I say it, I get goosebumps because you realize what we are capable of, what we can do. The other realization was the ability of capitalism. It's almost like this seven-headed serpent. When you chop off one head, the other head rises. As Steph mentioned, soon the WTO multilateral agreements were to be replaced by bilateral agreements. When we surged and showed our power, we saw how opposition is criminalized. We were called anti-development, we were called anti-this, anti-that, anti-trade, and the truth was that we were for democracy, for human rights, for immigrant rights, for women's rights, for children's rights, if you look at that. So while the corporations were very successful at taking a new stance, and as we see the continuation of this, industrial prison complex, and I would also say the industrial military complex, it is the same forces at work. It is the global capitalism, which is seeking to make more and more profits. But a lot of people would also say, and I've asked 25 years later, where is the trade movement? What they don't realize, or what they're trying to hide, that it is that movement that stood not just anti or against WTO, but the movement which was for human rights, for migrant worker rights, for women's rights. It is the same movement which is marching in the streets against the industrial military complex. It is the same movement which is standing up and saying no to a genocide or calling for divestment from Israel. So it is the same movement which is founded in the principles of justice, on being on the right side of history, which is built on cross-border alliances, which is forcefully taking on the same powers which hope to profit and continue to get rich, even if the majority of the worlds get poor or the environment is destroyed. Some of the key lessons from that time which guide my work today is accountability. The lessons in democracy that Steph described, those lessons have touched upon me as a human being, but also the work that I do at the Oakland Institute as a policy think tank while doing research, looking at investment policies in the name of food security when there are land grabs happening, while we do meticulous research. But it is really done at the request of the communities who are directly impacted, ensuring that the agreements and information that we come across is first of all made available to the communities whose lives are being devastated, whose water, whose territories, whose land is being stolen. But the biggest lesson I would say is that I have learned, which kind of impacts our work at the Institute, along with accountability to the impacted communities, is to never operate from a place of fear. I think what happened in Seattle, tear gas, pepper sprayed, hearing the choppers in the sky while the Union trucks blasted, look what's going on. It was a recognition that the human spirit standing together for humanity, for justice, for human rights cannot be defeated. Yes, when we do that, we'll see the worst. They'll criminalize. We have seen, laws. We have seen further attempts at division. Even soon after WTO, we saw attempts at making divisions at China because of human rights abuses, because of issues around worker rights, should not be allowed to be a member of the WTO, as if WTO was a very sacred entity where human rights abusers like China should not be a member of that. By that definition, my own country, India, should not be a member of the WTO. United States, with its political prisoners, by funding genocide, things like that, should not be a member of the WTO. So understanding the divisions that they were trying to create and being really smart about it, because they are quick to learn that our source of strength is a unity. It was a unity between workers, between farmers from different countries. It was a unity between the turtles, the environmentalists who were marching in the streets of Seattle, together with the unions. So when they come at us, to be ready to defend our unity and that we cannot be divided, and it has to be the long-term goal. We have to understand that this is a marathon race. This is not a quick sprint. We cannot look for quick yields and then say victory is done. This is going to be an exercise that will continue, perhaps through a lifetime. It's a battle that will continue. The Battle of Seattle shall continue as long as I think I'm on this planet. It'll just show up in different ways. And it's not a battle. It's really an opportunity to create relationships, to forge new relationships, to build a family. And I'm delighted to be with some of the family members here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anuradha. Invite folks to introduce themselves in the chat if you haven't, and also you can read who all's joining us. What amazing gathering of folks over these interwebs. I think the year after Seattle, I was invited to a Students Against Sweatshop conference, I believe in Chicago. And that was when I met some of the farm workers from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and Merle, who helped organize the Student Farmworker Alliance early on. And I was showing workshops about how to use arts in your organizing, as we had done in the WTO. And Merle was the person who said, hey, would you come to Immokalee and show us how to make puppets out of cardboard boxes and a few things like that. And so so for the last, I think 23, 24 years, I've been enrolled in what I call the University of Immokalee, learning from some of the most sophisticated and effective organizing in North America against what was probably the most ruthless working conditions for low-wage workers in North America. Merle's now in Minneapolis, continuing to work with migrant and low-wage workers for justice. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I was reflecting on where I was 25 years ago. And so 25 years ago, I was in graduate school at University of Florida, and I was studying Latin American studies and social movements in Latin America. But I was one of those students just sitting behind a computer, complaining about the world and doing nothing, right? And like at that time, I was watching indie media, and I saw in indie media the protests in Seattle, and I was just like blown away of like, what is happening? This sort of thing does not happen in the United States. And it was like eye-opening for me. It was just like thinking about a new world of possibilities. Around that same time, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was organizing their third strike, and their third general strike in Immokalee, Florida. And again, I was like, it's Florida, a general strike, farm workers. This is not something that's supposed to be happening. And I gotta go learn and see what's going on. So at that time, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was very focused on like deep in the community, or organizing around the growers and the crew leaders in their community and fighting violence in the workplace and really fighting wage theft and labor trafficking. Right at the time when I made it down there, shortly after the WTO protests, they were organizing a march across the state of Florida, and I joined that march. And I went up and down the march and met the workers, and I met the students and people of faith who were on that march. And a group of us as students decided that we wanted to form an organization that would organize in solidarity with the workers. And so we founded the Student Farmworker Alliance out of that movement. And it was part of this eye-opening for myself and for many of the students who went on that march. Here I was, a white man sitting in graduate school in the wealthiest country in the world, and I was just sitting and complaining about the world. And now here's this group of workers who everybody says they're not supposed to have any power. They're not supposed to be able to do anything, like have power to move things. And they were standing up and changing the world around them. And it was just mind-blowing for us as students. Of like, this is what organizing is. We want to be involved in this. Right at that time, the Immokalee workers also started looking up the supply chain and realized that there were really powerful corporate interests that were at play, that were influencing the conditions on the ground. And so they found a connection that Taco Bell was one of the major buyers of tomatoes that were produced in Florida. And they would leverage the power that they had of how many tomatoes that they were buying to be able to lower the price of those tomatoes. And then you see the real life consequences of labor trafficking and wage theft and sexual harassment and all of the conditions that workers face in that supply chain. Then us as students were also approaching this of looking at corporate power and corporate interests. We were looking at fast food and thinking about how companies like McDonald's, what influence did they have over our lives? And Taco Bell, what influence did they have over our lives? Taco Bell looked at us and like actually like published studies about how my generation, our generation was a hedonistic generation, and we don't care about anything but ourselves. And that's what they were actively trying to promote for young people to be, just consumers that don't think about anything else. They were busy privatizing our universities. They were very much at the forefront with Aramark and coming onto our campuses and privatizing the food on our campuses. So we were also approaching this from a perspective of how are these corporate interests impacting us, and how are they impacting the workers, and let's stand together to be able to coordinate bigger change. So we started organizing tours around the country, and we were really like with busloads of workers bringing what was hidden in the shadows for years and years right through the doorsteps of the companies, right? And really highlighting the power that corporations hold over both us as consumers and the workers. The Student Farmworker Alliance started organizing the Boot the Bell campaign. So where Taco Bell was on campuses, we would start to organize to be able to push Taco Bell off of our campuses until they were willing to sit down and meet with the workers. So all of this years and years of organizing has really led to huge transformational changes in Immokalee and in the lives of thousands of farm workers, right? Like where Immokalee was once considered ground zero of labor trafficking in the country. Now, through the Fair Food Program, labor trafficking has been eliminated. We've seen $50 million going out of the hands of these corporate interests and right into the pockets of the workers who used to be in the most marginalized and exploited workplaces. And I think that when I think about the lessons of the organizing, we were organizing students around these same interests, around how are corporations really influencing our day-to-day lives. But I think the core lessons that I draw out of those moments, and what I think a lot of worker centers around the country are looking at is like when directly impacted communities are at the front of movements and are really looking up the chain and seeing where power really lies, that oftentimes it's usually not your employer. There's multiple layers behind that and where the money interests actually lie. And if you can hit that node and have the solidarity of students, young people, people of faith, standing with the people directly impacted, you can change, you can win massive changes. And I think the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has really shown that what's possible by doing that, and been an inspiration for a lot of other worker organizing that's happening now around the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merle. Very inspirational and educational organizing for myself. And I just think of Coalition of Immokalee Workers as a university that so many students and community folks have learned from observing their organizing and participating in it. And super excited that Lupe from Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Cincinnati is going to join us, and Peter will turn it on. Thank you so much, Lupe.
Sí, gracias a todos y gracias, Merle, por compartir esta historia. Es muy bonito cómo la historia, ¿verdad?, ha cambiado mucho de las condiciones para los trabajadores.
So, thank you for having us here in this space. Also, thank you, Merle, for sharing a bit on that history. And, it's true, a lot of what has happened has changed, the conditions for workers greatly.
Y pues sí, el programa de comida justa ha venido a hacer cambios bastante importantes. Yo soy una trabajadora que salió de esos campos, ¿no?, donde pasaba muchos abusos, pero el rancho donde yo trabajaba entró al programa de comida justa. Entonces, básicamente, pues toda esta lucha que Merle estaba mencionando sí tuvo un impacto y sigue teniendo un impacto en los trabajadores agrícolas.
And so the Fair Food Program has changed greatly the conditions for farm workers. For example, I am, was a farm worker. I was in the fields, and the farm where I was working entered the program, and it, completely changed the conditions that I was experiencing. And so, it really kind of does just show how different the conditions are for workers, how much that has changed.
Pero pues ahorita todavía seguimos en campaña. El programa es un éxito, se sigue la expansión, pero lastimosamente fuera del programa siguen habiendo condiciones malas para trabajadores en la industria agrícola.
And the program itself, right, that came, out of all the action and the history of action that we have had. However, unfortunately, outside of the program, a lot of the abuses, right, continue happening.
Por ejemplo, ahorita en los casos más recientes que nosotros como organización hemos trabajado son con trabajadores que vienen con la visa de H2A, y hay casos de esclavitud moderna que se trabajó recientemente con casos en Georgia, casos en Florida.
And so even recently, right, within the past few years, some of the cases that we have been seeing involving workers who come to the U.S. under an H-2A visa, are experiencing things like, forced labor or modern day slavery. And these things are happening, recently as today.
Entonces, para nosotros continuar con nuestras campañas y seguir trayendo más corporaciones para expandir el programa es algo no solamente necesario, sino urgente.
Yeah. And so for us to kind of continue with this campaign work, to continue pushing for, corporations to join the program, for us, it's not just necessary, it's urgent.
Y como lo estaba mencionando Merle, pues el apoyo de los consumidores a nivel nacional es algo bien importante, porque sin el apoyo de los consumidores, nosotros no hubiéramos podido mover a las corporaciones. Sin todo ese movimiento de estudiantes, de líderes de fe, de grupos comunitarios que lucharon y siguen luchando con nosotros, no podríamos ganar a estas corporaciones.
And, as Merle was, mentioning earlier, a lot of these changes were possible, through the struggle that we have had and through the help of consumers, right? Consumers such as students, people of faith, different community groups, continuing to build that pressure, with consumers is, and that struggle lasting over years is what has made, these changes possible.
Y obviamente sin el apoyo de los artistas como David, que siempre nos ha ayudado a dar buenas ideas para nuestro arte, para mostrar nuestro mensaje. Entonces, cada una de las partes tiene una contribución importante para esta lucha y las victorias que hemos ganado, las hemos ganado a pulso, como decimos, ¿verdad? Que la hemos sufrido y la hemos luchado, pero tiene un impacto bien bonito en la vida.
And that also includes, artists. For example, David, who has helped us to kind of create our art, who has helped us, help to teach how to deliver that message through art. And it's, through this relationship that we have with consumers that we, have been able to struggle. And a lot of that, some of it is difficult, but then it also kind of is able to create something beautiful.
Entonces, hablando de arte, hablando de protestas, hablando de cosas de lucha, estamos aquí en Cincinnati ahorita porque estamos haciendo alcance para una acción que vamos a tener el 27 y 28 de septiembre y voy a dejar a Joa que ella hable un poquito más de este evento.
And so talking about, protests, talking about art, talking about struggle, we're in Cincinnati, we're from Immokalee, but we're in Cincinnati now, organizing ahead of an action that we're going to have on the September 27th and September 28th. And I'll speak a bit more on that. So essentially, we will be in front of Kroger headquarters on September 27th and 28th. They are one of the corporations who are currently trying to get to join onto the program. As Merle was mentioning, kind of bringing these campaigns to the forefront, you have to have consumers understand what's actually happening behind a brand. And so we're in Cincinnati doing presentations, meeting with different community groups, building that consciousness here. And in a few weeks, we'll have an exhibition out there, an exhibit out there, kind of showing some of that, history and just how much things have changed for workers. Additionally, we have a 15-foot tall farm worker puppet who's going to be out in front of Kroger, kind of taking up a lot of space. And so that's happening on September 27th and 28th. And for those who are not able to join in person in Cincinnati in front of Kroger headquarters, we also have a virtual action that people can plug into where you can deliver letters, you can send emails, you can call in to Kroger, and we'll share that in the chat. But thank you for allowing us to share that.
Sí, muchas gracias por invitarnos y vamos a dejar ahí la información. Ojalá que puedan apoyarnos de donde estén. Y gracias, Merle, gracias, David. Y Stephanie, te vi por ahí. Saludos.
And so, thank you for everybody. Thank you for inviting us and, allowing us to share. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Merle. Also, hi to Stephanie. We saw you earlier, and we'll share the link. And from wherever you are, if you're near Cincinnati, come out and see us on the 27th or 28th. And if you are from afar, then you can participate in the action virtually as well.
Gracias, Lupe, por las palabras and un buen ejemplo, for such good words and a good example. And also thank you for the translation, Laura. And you were with Student Farmworker Alliance. Can you just introduce yourself and then you'll share the links for us in the chat?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Joe. I am from Immokalee, Florida. Both of my parents were farm workers, but I didn't really know about the movement that came out of there until I went to college. I actually was really surprised to hear that, Merle, you went to UF. I also went to UF. And while I was at UF, I introduced myself in a class and they were like, oh, Immokalee, like the Immokalee workers. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And kind of really got into the SFA space. I started a chapter out at the University of Florida, and we kick Wendy's off our campus because that's another piece of things is that, especially when we've escalated a campaign to the point where we've launched a boycott, you push students, you engage students to cut contracts on their campuses with those corporations until they sign on. And so that's what we did on my campus. And then I was like, you know what, I might as well, after I graduate, become an organizer. So I'm now organizing with the CIW, and we're out in Cincinnati now. But I did really enter this space through SFA, and I'm really glad for what that has taught me. The question was what I was doing 25 years ago. I wasn't born, but I'm hoping to engage, now, and then maybe 25 years later, I can reflect on this moment.
Gracias. Thank you both. Just wanted to invite Steph, Anuradha, Merle, to share any reflections you have on, and Lupe and Joe, any reflections you have on listening to each other. Just anything that comes up. I mean, it's a process of collective thinking and learning and organizing. So whatever comes up. And then also invite folks to, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and Peter will try to collect them and we'll respond. I'll just call through the order that we initially spoke, and just Steph, you just want to share any reflections, comments you have on listening to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thank you, and so great to be with everybody, and great to see you, Lupe, and everybody. It speaks to the power of connections, and I think Anuradha spoke to it, Merle spoke to it, Lupe spoke to it. They exploit our divisions, and when we can come together, when we can connect and build across front lines, across states, across regions, all the differences that get in our way and create or seem to create barriers. It is when we can find and identify the enemy, the opposition, the groups and the ways that they work. And I just really appreciate what every speaker has really connected to. So there's the organizing that we do in the streets. And I mean, we learned so much just how to be in the streets in 2013 from CIW and the farm worker crew, how to march over many days and miles and people, and the kind of beautiful community that you can build at that time. And then there's also the research work that Anuradha is talking about, of like, how do these institutions work? And so then how do we take them apart? So there's multiple layers. And I guess the biggest thing, and one of the things that we said often after 1999, was that we all have a role to play. We all have something to contribute to this fight and to this work and organizing for liberation. And I think we often, it gets mysterious, or it seems like we have to know all the jargon, or we have to have an understanding of everything perfectly. But it really, right now, especially in these times, it just feels like even more we need to understand ourselves, see our position. We do need to understand ourselves, not just as activists that care about a thing, but or even conscious people, but to really identify our position, where power is arranged around us and what we can do about it. And we have to do that together and in collectivity. And so I think just the relationships reflected on this very small panel reflects 25 years of building those relationships and organizational partnerships that is going to be what it takes to defeat these systems and to build a different world. So just really appreciate the opportunity, because I don't think we're just remembering or commemorating or being nostalgic about a moment, but we're really trying to learn from it and build from it towards what we're building now. So thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. Before you go, Anuradha, I actually forgot to share a few of my own comments. I was in facilitator mode, so I'll just shout out that thanks to City Lights, 20 years ago, I put together a lot of the authors who inspired me, including the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, including Tom Wetzel, brilliant revolutionary housing organizer from San Francisco, who sort of wrote their best practices, their analysis, and put 33 essays into a book. And then I did a book tour, but I dressed up as Robin Hood because we have lots of our historical zapatas, but a lot of the kids and people don't all know who they are, but everyone knows who Robin Hood is, that he takes from the rich and gives back to the rest of us. So I painted what's called a consistoria. I'll just share a few pages with you with a few thoughts, but we'd travel around, tell the story, and then usually at the end we'd do strategy workshops with folks, get them practicing how to plan their strategy for their movements. But when the book came out, it was a few years after Seattle. I was really trying to articulate what I felt like were a new ways of organizing new politics. I call it new radicalism that emerged in the wake of the Zapatistas. And one thing that was happening in 2003 is that we were 1 year into an imperial war in the Middle East for empire and oil, which sounds very familiar to right now. And our local group in the Bay Area, Action for Local Global Justice, actually, we somewhat set aside our global justice work and said, okay, we should actually be in the anti-war movement. And we tried to insert a bigger systemic analysis and said, when we live in a country with 800 military bases in 130 other people's country, we live in an empire, and that has different pillars and things that result from it. And that whether you are an anti-war or solidarity activist, work on economic justice or corporate globalization or environmental and climate chaos, that we're not going to achieve any of these unless we also take on the empire. So one of the conventional beliefs is that the global justice movement sort of dispersed in the wake of September 11th and then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would actually argue that we didn't do a good enough job educating our global justice movement about empire and about the war and terror that is part of it. And so when September 11th happened, we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared to shift and say, we want to globalize justice, not war. Instead, we stood down and lost a lot of momentum. So encouragement for whatever sector you work in to develop that anti-empire analysis, and what that looks like right now is stepping up around Gaza and Palestine. And also, if you're focused just on Gaza and Palestine, to also look at, that in a country with 800 military bases, that we actually have to figure out how do we start pull the U.S. out of the rest of the world and to stop being an empire, so the next generation can actually go about rebuilding stuff instead of fighting the next war. So just one thought on that. And then trying to look a little bit about some of the common things of what I call the new radicalism. How do we build a better world? And the book is divided into three parts. One is what's the problem, different analysis. One is how do we change things, which is a bunch of really brilliant strategy writings, not by me, but by people who inspired me and that I learned from. And the last one is ideas and action. And just, as we were, throw up one more, as we were organizing for Seattle, we were very much, as Stephanie mentioned, part of a global movement. And so this is a quote from the Zapatistas, that there's actually two projects of globalization, and that they're in conflict: globalization from above, cynicism, stupidity, war, and a globalization from below: rebellion, hope, creativity, and a world in which many worlds fit. And that is so key, and was so key, that we're very much part of People's Global Action. Went to meetings with them in India before we hit the streets. But just some of the thoughts on things that I saw in common with some of the groups is that they had a systemic or a big picture analysis about not just stuck in a single issue, but how things were connected, and that we didn't want to just change the suit, the roots. That direct action was core, and not just single mobilizations, but actually campaigns of escalating direct action and training and preparing how we do that. As Merle and Lupe mentioned, that the idea that the change comes from below, that we build power from below, not just trying to influence those above, and that people have a voice directly. And finally, just the idea that we're scientists experimenting in a laboratory of resistance, that what worked last time doesn't always work. We can learn from it, but we're constantly experimenting. We should be innovative and creative, and that the real value in any experiment is that as a scientist, you sort of analyze what worked, what didn't, how can you do it different, and keep experimenting. So encouragement to all of us as movement scientists to keep experimenting and keep innovating. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Anuradha for your reflections. Sorry for skipping my my pictures there.
That was absolutely brilliant, David, and loved it. We could have, yeah, we could go through each of these art paintings and have such a rich conversation. I think the only thoughts that I would share, which is, and I'm glad you mentioned Zapatistas. What happened in Seattle happened because of what came before that. Whether it was the Indian farmers who tore down the offices of Cargill when, when the U.S. Ambassador to India had talked about they would do whatever they needed to do to destroy India's protectionism. The farmers used the pickaxes to destroy the building, and they said that this was a nonviolent protest because they were hurting the building, the instruments that were destroying their livelihoods. They were not hurting people. Or if it were the Zapatistas, as they gave the definition of what globalization is, which was, as a euphemism, taken by the WTO. The other thing that comes to mind, looking at the chat, looking at what was said, it is intergenerational. The struggle for justice is intergenerational, and it's beautiful to see what the University of Florida has been doing. And well, perhaps it's going to be the university that will be kind of one of the big ones to divest from Israel, boycott, sanctions, and divestment. So it's inspirational to see. I think the other thing I would say, in addition to what we all have touched upon, cross-border alliances, cross-issue alliances, to see ourselves really as an assembly line. The role of, I was delighted to see somebody mention Martin Kaur, an activist, a friend, an intellectual from Malaysia, who was on one hand educating the delegates from southern countries. I mean, here they were, one or two representing the whole continent of Africa, whereas this army of US trade negotiators that would descend on them and hammering away the trade agreements that they've not had a chance to see. And people like Martin, who would spend day and night informing, educating the southern delegates, but also educating people in the United States. What was that multilateral investment agreement? What does it really mean? So seeing this, assembly line, because the work that is needed, as was discussed, that we have to expose who are these economic powers that gain from these agreements, or the wars that we see, or this empire. Who is behind that empire? The researchers, the intellectuals who do the boring work of going through these agreements, but really seeing this assembly line and how it all comes together, the organizers. And there will be attempts, again, I would say, to create divisions. It is so important for the solidarity, the North-South solidarity, the ability to see the South, the poverty in the North, the ability to see that we cannot divide and let the workers be divided. We see that happen when the pandemic breaks out. It is very easy to create this sense of the other, and identifying that the struggle for economic justice cannot be separated from dismantling white supremacy, that the struggle for economic justice for workers in one country cannot be separated from the struggle for protecting the rights of nature, that the struggle for justice cannot be separated from, say, indigenous rights to being able to demand human rights. So I think when we put the lens of human rights being universal, that the standards that apply to China also apply to the United States, that the standards that apply to Russia also apply to Israel. Otherwise, we will be defeated if we don't see that we have to be led by our values and principles and conviction, and not just what's convenient.
Thank you, Anuradha. Merle, any thoughts you can share? Reflections?
Yeah, very quickly, I think sometimes it's easy for to get lost in your community and get like really deep in the weeds of like what's happening the Twin Cities and how we're organizing there, right? But it's always inspirational and fun to be able to pick our heads up and look around and hear what is happening out there, and just really appreciate being in the space with all of you and seeing the bigger picture, and just like hearing the theme of solidarity coming up over and over, and really the importance for all of us to realize how we are impacted by the systems, by like really the 0.1% that is driving a lot of this extraction of wealth out of our communities. And when we make the connections of how we are all impacted by that system, that's where we've seen that we can win the changes. And I think like last theme that I hear out of this that is inspirational to me is that I think for in a lot of our movement circles, we as a movement often get stuck on the ways that the 0.1% extracted wealth from us 50 years ago. And they are constantly evolving and finding new strategies to extract wealth out of our communities and pit us against each other to fight while they continue to get wealth. And we often get trapped in organizing in the same ways from the past. But I get this idea, I think what you said, David, earlier just resonated with me, is like, we have to continue experimenting. We have to look at like, how are they evolving and how are we not just keeping up with them, but we're getting ahead of them. We're not just reacting to what they're doing, but we are building our own alternatives. And yeah, so it's just inspirational to be in circles of people that are looking from that vision. So thank you.
Thank you, Merle. Peter, have you been collecting questions? I don't know if you have the capacity, but
indeed we have. Let's see what we've got here. Beginning with, let me scroll up a little bit here. Sarah asks, can you give an update on the agreement on agriculture in the WTO? Are there any current leverage points you see?
Thank you for asking. But can I just jump in? Sorry, I didn't ask. If that's for me, I apologize. Yeah, in terms of the agreement on agriculture, what it attempted to obtain, unfortunately has happened. The push for countries to end having their reserves, for instance, to allow the free flow of agricultural goods, which has turned into African nations, for instance, to be dependent on food imports. Or if we look at a place like Mexico, these agreements which have been put in place have basically destroyed, and they ignore the power play between the farmers, campesinos in Mexico with, say, farmers, I'm talking about Cargill and ADMs in the United States. So with this, unequal playing fields that have been created with the subsidies and the Farm Bill of the United States, you have this juggernaut of United States and countries like Canada, which can dump in the developing world, or the third world countries, I should say, because many of them are ancient living civilizations, so most of them are. So they are dumping the cheap produce in these countries, not because they can grow food more efficiently. This food is grown, commodities actually are grown by through pesticides, by destroying the topsoil, by destroying biodiversity. But the Farm Bill and subsidies allow it to be dumped in these countries, destroying the environment and destroying the livelihoods of small family farmers around the world. I think when we had the food price crisis in 2007, 2008, we saw what happens when countries do away with their food security or food sovereignty. Suddenly they were dependent on or waiting for food. And with the food prices that increased by over 75%, the dire straits that the poor found themselves in poor countries led to political upheaval in many countries, from Madagascar to India and other places. So, so yes, in terms of the agreement on agriculture, many of us are not just looking at that. We are looking at the other aspects of opening up of economies, as it's called, the liberalization, which has allowed dumping of commodities from cotton to corn, and then you top it with the genetically modified foods that are being dumped in countries and what the ramifications of that is. So that's another struggle. So as we said, it is not just one struggle that's originated from Seattle, but there are many layers of it, and that work continues.
Thank you, Anuradha. Peter?
So Roshi asks, do you think we would be in the political predicament we are now, both globally and in the US, or did you think, I should say, we would be in the political predicament we are in now, both globally and the US? I find it challenging to think of history as a progression and building from the WTO. So many curveballs happen historically. 9/11, it destroyed almost, and I still have hope, our freedom of protest and free speech. It got curbed a lot.
Steph or Merle, and shout out to amazing Bay Area organizer Roshi, if that's the correct Roshi. If
there aren't any comments, we also have another comment from Susan. The WTO demonstration was important in bringing activist artists across so-called Northern America into network with one another. These relationships have endured. You showed how to do things in a good way with 100 hands, quote unquote, as my friend Catherine says.
I'll respond. Susan Semensky Batilia is a longtime movement artist going back to the anti-Vietnam War movement and based in Milwaukee. And I think that was that was one of the places that we really experimented. Steph and I and folks who had been experimenting with street theater and puppets and art really took everything we learned and threw it hard, and the arts and the culture were really central to our organizing, and it spread outward. So encouragement to folks to experiment with that, and also just saying, as a activist who's been organizing for 45 years, having some kind of a practice where you actually get to create things with your hands together also can keep us in this movement for multiple generations. So encouragement for everyone to find some way to plug into the movement ecosystem that feeds their soul and heals.
So I had a question of whether this event is going to be posted somewhere, whether it's recording is. And yes, it's going to be posted on our YouTube page, just so that you know. Those of you who've registered will get an email.
Yeah, I think to that first question, or the question that you were just asking about the political moment and imagining ourselves here 25 years later, and I think it's important because I think we've been speaking and looking back 25 years, it's critical to think about social movement history and what the forces we're contending with all the time. So history is not that straight line, and it's also not a circle that repeats itself, right? We're constantly in a conversation, a battle, back and forth with power and learning and reiterating and I think evolving. And especially if we can apply more imagination, the creativity that folks are speaking of, David and Merle and others, about what we need to design in terms of new arrangements of power, while at the same time really truly contending with the forces that are so powerful and often daunting, and definitely reconfiguring in this particular moment. And so understanding how they reconfigure, as folks are speaking to, is important at the same time that we're building and learning. And I think as Anuradha was speaking to as well, like, we have to learn from the lessons of all these movements that have come before and the current movements that are happening now. And I think just shouting out the many movements that are rising that are more and more global in character feels really exciting and heartening, because I think we're going to be able to hold those connections. And I think if we remember the lessons from 25 years and where we did lose ground, I think that we can hold the lessons, hold the relationships, hold those partnerships, craft and carve new ones out, But that feels really important to speak to when this moment feels daunting. And as authoritarianism and fascism is rising, they are coordinated. And so the challenge to us is to coordinate in much stronger, more interesting, more imaginative, more powerful ways.
Huge gratitude to everyone who was able to spend their Tuesday evening with us. Huge thank you to Steph, Anuradha, Merle, Lupe, Joe for joining us, and thank you Peter and City Lights for hosting us. And look forward to seeing you in the laboratory of resistance, scientists.
Well, thank you, David, for organizing this moment, and Stephanie, Anuradha, Merle, thanks for gracing our virtual halls. There is great power in solidarity and community, and you certainly proved that tonight. We are strengthening the threads that allow the continuum of organizing and resistance to move forward. And City Lights is grateful to all of you, and all of you in the room as well, who have also played a role. We're very grateful to you all. We have posted links in the chat with which you may learn more about everyone's respective organizations, also with which you may purchase books. City Lights has a massive collection of books on activism, on solidarity movements, and so on and so forth. So come down, visit us. We're in North Beach. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. Would love to see you. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our publishing program, our events, and educational outreach. Be well, everyone. Take care, and hope to see you all again soon.